So in this video, we are going to look at the economics of team behavior. What is it that sports teams, franchises do? Okay. So each team, so you have the overall league. So you have for example, the NFL, the National Football League, right? But then you have each team, which is owned by an individual entity. So each team is its own entity, but it's not like a typical firm where that firm's profits are depend on how that firm actually performs. With professional sports and sports leagues, a team's financial success is also largely dependent on the success of the league as a whole. Because of this, teams will often cooperate in certain areas to benefit the league as a whole, which will help to cut down on competition from other sports leagues. Now, when you talk about economics, one of the main assumptions is that the primary goal of businesses is to what? To maximize their profits. But this is not as simple when you talk about sports, because owners can also be driven by the urge to win. Okay? And so when you're talking about business, most of the goals come down to money. But with sports, it's not always the case, because you have owners who really, really want to win. And yes, money is important, but they also have other business ventures, so they don't necessarily need to turn a profit, especially in the short term. So the question with sports leagues comes down to, do the teams, owners, do they want to maximize their profits or maximize their wins? Okay. So similar to other firms, sports franchises do need to be profitable to stay in business, okay, at least in the long term. But in doing so, they can look at long term versus short term. Right? So some teams may choose to earn more profits in the short run and long run, but others may think more long term. So they may think, okay, maybe we'll take a loss now, but if we're really good, that can help us more down the road. And so they can look at maximizing wins in the short run to make them more profitable in the long run. So if we look at the two tables we have here, tables 3.1 and 3.2, a lot of times, and we'll talk about this a little bit, people can think that profit in sports is driven by the market, to where the bigger market teams, the teams with more fans, will be more profitable than teams that are not. Okay, and the teams that are in the smaller markets. And so here's a couple of examples. So this, for baseball, you have the 2011 to 2016 seasons, and you have the Phillies in Philadelphia, the Yankees in New York, the Indians in Cleveland, and the Royals in Kansas City. And so when you look at this, you have two relatively big market teams, the Phillies and the Yankees, and two smaller market teams, the Indians and the Royals. Now, in those years, the Phillies and Yankees had pretty good winning percentages, higher attendance, more revenue. But for the Phillies, they actually operated at a loss during that, and the Yankees at a relatively small gain. Whereas the Indians and Royals, who were in smaller markets and during those years did not have winning records, they had less revenue, but their profits were also a lot more. So, as we're going to talk about more in this course, one of the things you need to do to win games is have the talent to do so. In order to have the talent to do so, you a lot of times have to pay for that talent. And so a lot of times there ends up being a trade-off between wins and profits, because in order to win, you need to pay your players more, and that will help to gain those wins, but affect your bottom line as far as profits. Another example is basketball. If you look at the Dallas Mavericks versus Toronto Raptors, you can see that the Toronto or Dallas Mavericks had, again, a bigger market, had decent winning percentage in these years, but they operated a loss every year. Whereas the Toronto Raptors, who were in a smaller market and had fewer wins, but they made profits. Now, the Dallas Mavericks are a little bit of a different story because the owner is Mark Cuban, and who is a billionaire, and if that team takes a loss, he's not going to necessarily be hurt too bad by it because he has other business ventures. So let's look at maximizing profits first. So profit is equal to the difference between the revenue that a firm brings in and the cost that they have to pay. And as you can see here, it shows that revenue and costs are both driven by W, which stands for win. So the profit of each team, I, is equal to the difference between the revenue that the team makes, which again is a factor of their wins, minus the cost, which is also a factor of the wins. And so the reason why is revenue depends on a team's winning, because the more the team wins, the more revenue they bring in. But at the same time, cost is also impacted by wins because, as I mentioned, you need to pay more to get those wins, and so the more wins tends to be correlated with more costs. So profits are maximized, okay, at the point where the revenue and costs are the furthest apart. Okay. And if you think back to some of your basic principles courses, specifically microeconomics, that distance between the total revenue and total cost is maximized when these two curves have the same slope. The slope of the total revenue, if you remember, is the marginal revenue. The slope of the total cost is the marginal cost. Okay. So if you look over here, you have the demand curve, and you have the marginal revenue curve, and then you have the marginal cost, which is assumed to be constant and equal to the average total cost. So a profit maximizing firm will maximize at the win level, because again, wins factor into both revenue and cost. So they'll maximize their profits at the win level, where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. And so it's right here. And so a firm that wants to maximize their profits will choose W1 wins. Now, I know they don't necessarily choose their, it's hard to choose your wins, but you can choose to spend enough, a certain amount of money to get those wins. And so they will target how much they are trying to win, basically, by spending on players. Now let's look at the other side of that, which is maximizing wins. So for simplicity, assume that profit can not be negative. Okay, I showed a case where it could be, but let's just assume for simplicity that it cannot be. All right. So assume that a firm will continue to operate as long as the total revenue they bring in is greater than or equal to the cost. Okay. So the firm will continue to try to win as long as they're not taking a loss. All right. So that is until the price, which is determined by the demand, is greater than or equal to the average cost of a win. So as long as the price is greater than the average cost, they will continue to win more and more and more. And so that will happen to this point here where the demand equals the marginal cost, which is the same as the average cost. So a firm that wants to maximize their wins will do so at W2 wins. Okay. If they did any more, they could spend more to win more, but then they'd be taking a loss, which again, just for this simplicity, we assume they would not do. Okay? So again, with a profit maximizing team, they would choose W1 wins, whereas with a win maximizing team, they would choose W2 wins.